One of the abiding obsessions of the 21st century is information, where it comes from, how it gets to us, how long it takes, how it's recorded, and how reliable it is. Now, information, in the sense of knowledge that we acquire from sources other than our own experience, has always existed. How to raise good crops and healthy children, what sort of people live down the road and across the water, what the government wants us to do or not to do, and what good or bad things should we expect to be coming our way. But the sources and character of this information have changed a lot over the centuries and the millennia. So, for example, from around 2200 years ago, we have the Rosetta Stone, which carved in 2 languages and 3 writing systems an official decree, and was set up in public so that both Greek and Egyptian speakers would be able to understand it. From the Middle Ages, we have the Donation of Constantine and the Pact of Omar, documents which were actually composed centuries after the time of the rulers to whom they were attributed, but were assumed to be authentic until modern critical analysis proved that they weren't. And from the 18th century, we have Samuel Johnson's dictionary, one man's effort to record in print how the English language should be used, but which was for a long time too expensive for most readers, and Poor Richard's Almanac, an affordable annual pamphlet in which Benjamin Franklin included not only information about the weather, but many of his own popular aphorisms. Now, of course, everyone can be their own source of information, their own publisher, and their own distributor. But we have to jump up and down and wave bright banners in order to get the attention of the surfing masses. In this series, we're going to look at how information has spread, or been spread, over the last 4,000 years or so. We'll need to be selective. Every society has its own forms of communication, and the word information can include everything from diplomatic correspondence to recipes. It could also include the knowledge passed from parents to children, or really between anyone within speaking distance. So we're going to limit ourselves to a few broad types of information and see how they've been created and transmitted over the course of the last several millennia. We'll begin with some of the first techniques for recording information, the cuneiform and hieroglyphic systems invented in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and with the scribes whose job it was to write them down. These systems led to the alphabets, Phoenician, Greek, Latin, and so on, which made reading and writing accessible to a somewhat larger and more varied population, and were adopted for a number of literary, commercial, and ideological purposes. But while a basic form of literacy may have been used by farmers and traders to keep their records, literature, poetry, philosophy, and so on, was limited to a small elite who were trained as children by hired teachers to read and write. And the only way to acquire the contents of a book was to pay someone else to copy over an existing one, or to listen to another reader recite it out loud. In fact, ancient poetry, one of the most important types of creative literature, was built around set rhythms which were designed to make it enjoyable to listen to. And many of the philosophical works of Plato were written as dialogues between several characters and combined the discussion of ideas with details of settings and character. Once there were books, there were also libraries, though they were much rarer than they would later become, and only a few scholars had access to them. There were also, throughout the ancient world, inscriptions on stone which were used to inform people about laws and regulations, or to honor important people like kings and publicize the accomplishments they claimed for themselves. Another form of public information was performance, like the classical Greek plays which communicated the writer's thoughts about the human condition in general, and the values of his society in particular. There were also more private forms of communication. Most of the cities of the ancient world were small by modern standards, and had clearly marked out meeting places where people could conduct their business face-to-face and find out what was going on. Those who wanted to communicate with people in other places and could write or could pay someone who knew how, could send letters, but they had to find someone to take them, such as a servant, a traveler, or a merchant caravan. Merchants could also carry news of recent events, though it might take months to spread very far. We have many letters, both private and official, from Han Dynasty China. And from the Roman Empire, we have, for example, the letters which the Apostle Paul wrote to the early churches of the Eastern Mediterranean, and the letters written by the first-century politician Cicero to his friends and family. Trading expeditions could take place either over land or by sea, both of which had their risks. Caravans, which carried expensive but easily transportable goods like spices, could be attacked, and ships could sink or run aground. The ancient Persians, the Roman Empire, and several Chinese dynasties built and maintained roads along with a system of fresh horses, vehicles, and rest stations. This made travel, and with it communication, faster, easier, and more secure. And though these systems were primarily intended for the use of government and military officials, they also encouraged trade along arteries like the Silk Road. While laws were by definition meant to be obeyed without question, and new ideas could be accepted or not as the listener liked, there was less certainty about what to do with information which may or may not have been accurate. The ancient world did recognize an essential difference between what the Greeks called myth, i.e., story, and historical reality. The first tended to belong to the distant past, a time when, it was believed, the rules of nature that we know were not yet fixed, and the human condition was very different. But at the same time, the ancients tended to respect tradition and to privilege established ideas and beliefs over unconventional ones, which made people more likely to accept what they were told if it had a long pedigree behind it. They also tended to assume that places and people far from their homelands, from which most people never traveled, could be very different from themselves, which made it easier to believe whatever fantastic stories about them they might happen to encounter. Starting in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, the Roman Empire disintegrated into a number of regional kingdoms in Western Europe, and the Byzantine Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. The disappearance of this centralized authority made travel, and with it the spread of information, more difficult and dangerous, as local regions began to rely more on their own resources. At the same time, the writers of the Middle Ages that followed tended to indulge their imaginations when describing distant locations to people who never ventured far from where they were born. And even works written by those few who did travel, like Marco Polo, included a great deal of legend and hearsay about foreign people, places, and animals. As the Middle Ages wore on, larger states like England and France began to appear. These states unified what had been splintered territories, and they had more centralized governments and larger bureaucracies, which made official communications and orders easier to transmit. At the same time, the growth of the medieval church aided the spread of information. Over the course of centuries, it developed its own organizational structure, with a hierarchy of officials, its own laws and courts, and a great deal of landed property. This system required a network of messengers and representatives who would keep local church officials properly informed. There were also periodic gatherings of religious officials from across the Christian world, at which theological questions were debated and religious laws were issued. Even among members of the clergy, literacy and education could be very limited, but starting in the 8th century, schools began to appear where men training to be priests or monks were taught to read and write in Latin, the language of Catholic worship and scholarship. They also studied the philosophy and the science of the time, and by the 13th and 14th centuries, such schools began to develop into the first European universities, which at first trained students in subjects like law and theology, but eventually branched out into other fields of information. Those priests, bishops, and monks who could read could then communicate their ideas to their illiterate parishioners. Another source of information during the Middle Ages was the series of monasteries founded across Europe by Irish monks, whose purpose was to train students in Latin literature and the visual arts. These institutions had scriptoria, in which ancient and medieval books were copied and stored, making them an important storehouse of the classical literature which would be revived during the Renaissance. And the residents often wrote their own works, such as commentaries on the Bible and studies of philosophy and theology. Outside of the church, information was spread along with the trade in goods which sprang up across Europe. In an age before remote communication, people had to come face to face to do business, and market towns developed along well-traveled roads where farmers and craftspeople could bring their products and exchange news. There were also annual fairs associated with cities like Cambridge in England, Castile in Spain, Bruges in Belgium, and Frankfurt in Germany. Travelers, merchants, and pilgrims could also carry private letters, whose production was made easier by the arrival of paper-making technology from China in the 13th century. While fairs and markets were sources of interesting information, stories, and even gossip, more official information, like new laws and regulations, were the responsibility of town criers, who were local officials entrusted with making announcements to the illiterate local population. These laws and regulations grew in number during the later Middle Ages, as the bureaucracies of Europe became more elaborate. Town criers might also report natural disasters like floods or droughts, or name people who were being sought by the authorities for violating the law. Among the ruling families of Europe, information was often handled and stored by heralds, who carried messages between opposing armies during wars and traveled as diplomats to the courts of foreign kings. They also kept records of the genealogy, ranks, and privileges of members of the nobility. A much more elaborate system of communicating information than anything found in medieval Europe was set up in the Mongol Empire of the 13th and 14th centuries. This system, like the ancient Persian one, consisted of a network of roads equipped with frequent stations where riders could switch horses or stop for food and rest. Though it was intended mainly for soldiers and government officials, it was also used by merchants and travelers. This system was a response to the fact that the Mongols had, in the course of a few decades, conquered a vast swath of land, which included Central Asia, China, and parts of Eastern Europe. Though they relied on experienced administrators to look after the local affairs of the areas they had conquered, they also had their own military and administrative apparatus, which required that they communicate directly with one another. Another of the communication networks of this period was used by the two great Arab caliphates of the Middle Ages, the Umayyad, which was based in Syria, and the Abbasid, which was based in Iraq. This network transmitted official documents and reports to the central government and could also transport officials. It also served as a communications network for military officers during battles, and was used by local administrators to submit intelligence reports about people whom they considered suspect. In the medieval Muslim world, private individuals who wished to share information could hire religious pilgrims and merchants just as their counterparts in Europe did. And the Sufi Brotherhood of Mystics set up a network of lodges across and beyond the Muslim world to house their members, who were sent out to teach their form of Islam to others. There were also elaborate communications networks in the Mali and Songhai empires, which dominated Western Africa during the later Middle Ages. These states engaged in overland trade within the region and with the Arab communities of North Africa, so the merchants who conducted this trade served as sources of information. There were also couriers who communicated between the royal courts of these empires and the rulers of their local provinces. As Muslims themselves, the inhabitants of these empires were a part of the same network of pilgrims and teachers as the Arabs with whom they traded, and they sometimes took part in the Hajj to Mecca. There were also West African institutions of Muslim scholarship, such as the University of Timbuktu in Mali, where books were written in Arabic. Within the towns of these empires, information was provided by performers called griots, who sang stories of the past which were preserved and transmitted by mouth from one generation to the next. These stories, like the ones told by European bards, tended to focus on famous and important figures of the past whose deeds might be embellished for dramatic effect. Unlike the heralds of Europe, they were expected to memorize the genealogies of noble families. As we enter the early modern period, around the 16th and 17th centuries, we find the regions of the northern hemisphere linked by increasingly frequent sea voyages and by the development of a regular overseas trade in raw materials, finished products, and human beings. This trade connected Europe with Africa, China, and the New World, as European soldiers, merchants, and missionaries traveled back and forth with news and information about the places they had seen, and the people they encountered learned about them in turn. Some of this information appeared in the form of printed books, the most important technological innovation behind the development of today's information culture. Within a little more than 100 years of Gutenberg's invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, there were about 3,000 printers producing at least 150 million books. Many of these books were editions of the ancient Greek and Roman texts, history, philosophy, biography, plays, and poetry, which had been preserved in manuscript form in medieval monasteries, but were now being rediscovered, translated, and printed. Early printed books were often too expensive even for many of those who could read, but as literacy rates increased, cheaper editions, smaller and without illustrations, began to be printed. Another new source of information starting early in the 17th century was newspapers, which published a combination of foreign news and gossip. While the books and newspapers of the time were printed, they weren't published in the sense that there were editors, authorities, or community standards to regulate their content or accuracy. But there were, particularly in France and England, cases of governments censoring books and newspapers which they saw as seditious, and the Catholic Church began in 1560 to publish a list of books which it prohibited because they were thought to challenge Catholic doctrine. But by the 17th century, Western thinkers had begun to embrace the idea that traditional, legendary, or supernatural claims should be met with skepticism and subjected to rational analysis, and that the freedom to express one's own opinion was essential. An important center of information exchange during this period was the coffee house. Because coffee was a stimulant rather than an intoxicant, it tended to be associated with serious businesses like trade and banking. And because the technology to make coffee at home did not yet exist, people had to gather together in order to enjoy it. Coffee houses also offered books and newspapers, and the free exchange of ideas with which they became associated led more than one government to try to shut them down or regulate them. By the 19th century, the average reader had still another option, as libraries, which had always belonged to wealthy individuals or institutions, began to be opened in England and the US for the use of the public, or at least the educated public, and the residents of large cities might have several daily newspapers from which to choose, representing a range of interests and political opinions. Somewhere between books and newspapers were political pamphlets, which were cheap to print and to sell. These were attacks, generally published anonymously, on the religious and political establishments of the time, and they were an essential part of the revolutions which sprang up beginning in the late 18th century. As the concept of professionalism began to develop, the companies which published books began to formulate standards which were meant to guarantee the accuracy of their contents and to protect against the common practice of taking material from previously published works without paying or even acknowledging the source. At the same time, newspapers began to develop standards which were meant to distinguish them from openly partisan pamphlets, though some publishers were infamous, especially in wartime, for publishing what would become known as propaganda. Universities began to open schools of journalism, some of which were endowed by wealthy newspaper publishers like Joseph Pulitzer, to train future writers in how to research and report their stories. Technological innovations have continued to shape the world of information since the 19th century, when the telegraph was invented. As an infrastructure which crossed the U.S. alongside the railroads, telegraph networks were subjected to government regulation, and much of their business was official or commercial rather than private. Another revolutionary invention of the 19th century was photography, which enabled for the first time the recording of images which could accurately document events, rather than representing them however the artist saw fit. But photographs would become an engine of propaganda by placing in a flattering light rulers like Hitler, Stalin, and the Kim family, or glorifying soldiers in wartime. Enemies of the state could even be cropped out, as if to show that they had never been there. Modern information culture has been shaped not only by technology, but by the idea that governments can and should shape those institutions which educate and inform. Since the 19th century, this has included constructing public libraries and public schools. Governments also began at that time to create inexpensive postal services which could link together businesses and individuals. These services could deliver printed material like books and pamphlets, and in the U.S., they played an important part in informing the public by delivering newspapers and almanacs to rural areas which at best could offer only local news. In the 20th century, the idea of a government interest in communication was extended to broadcasting, to radio, and then television. Though this interest was fundamentally based upon the idea that the airwaves are a public resource which must be distributed fairly so that private companies won't monopolize the limited number of broadcast frequencies, government involvement has often extended to controlling content, whether through state-owned networks or the regulation of private ones. This regulation has varied from controlling content regarded as obscene, to encouraging serious cultural content, to featuring the stories and languages of underrepresented ethnic groups. But it may also be used to censor challenging or marginalized voices, or to describe in uncritical and even adoring terms the people or groups in power. Even at its most inclusive, broadcast information was limited at best to once daily news reports, which in the U.S. appeared on the 3 TV networks. This meant that most Americans were being told the same thing at the same time, which in itself was a powerful source of influence. We now find ourselves at a time when every one of these technological and social developments is being overturned. The paper on which books and newspapers are printed is becoming a thing of the past, and so is the business of producing them, as people are increasingly becoming their own publishers. The airwaves on which broadcasts were shared have given way to online and subscription services which aren't subject to the content standards imposed by regulatory agencies or advertisers, and the governments and companies which used to be our main sources of information and entertainment must now share the stage, as formerly mass media are being replaced by content made by and for small groups and individuals. At the same time, the institutions which referee printed matter like books, newspapers, and journal articles, editorial boards, fact-checkers, peer reviewers, and so on, have no control, for better or worse, over the output of the influencers and content producers, who need answer to no one but the followers who raise their profiles and the subscribers who sustain them financially. Our supply of information has also become practically, and often literally, instantaneous, what with 24-hour news and constantly updated websites. In some ways, these changes take us back to the ancient roots of information sharing, when there was often nothing to control what stories people might tell or what claims they might make, and nothing but the judgment of the listener or the reader to decide whether or not to accept them. So let's keep this in mind in the weeks ahead, as we look back toward the roots and the growth of our information culture.